Hi everyone, it's Pastor Wagner, and this is my weekly video blog. Today I want to talk about why the Catholic Bible has too many books in it. Now, as you know, the King James Bible has 39 books in its Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi. The Catholic Bible, though, has 46 books, which is 7 more than that, and it has these additional books in it are called the Apocrypha. Apocrypha means a writing or statement of doubtful authorship or authenticity, specifically those books included in the Septuagint and Vulgate versions of the Old Testament, which were not originally written in Hebrew and not counted genuine by the Jews. So the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, was the Catholic version of the Bible, and the Septuagint was a Greek version of the Old Testament, which was not what the Jews used originally. The Hebrew Old Testament, or the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. That's what the Jews used, and that's what Jesus used as well. These 7 books of the Apocrypha are Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach, and Baruch. These books were not part of the original Jewish canon, and they're still not part of the Jewish canon today. Now, the Jewish Hebrew scriptures contained 24 books. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, why were they only 24 books, but the King James has 39 books in it? It's because that the 39 books of the King James are expanded versions of those 24 books. So within those 24 books, some of those 24 books included several of the books in the King James that the King James has, and they included those just in one book. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about here presently. So here's a list of the 24 books of the Jewish canon, which happen to be the exact same things in the King James, just the King James, some of the books are split up into multiples. You had the 5 books of Moses, which was the law, which was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You had the 8 books of the prophets, which was called the prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel. Now in the King James, that's split up into 1st and 2nd Samuel. Kings, in the King James, is split up into 1st and 2nd Kings. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, or the minor prophets. Now the 12 are separated in the King James into Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then there were the 11 books of the writings, or the Psalms, in the Jewish canon. That was Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, and Ezra, Nehemiah. In the Jewish canon, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. In the King James, it's split up into 2 books, Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles, which is split up into 2 books in the King James, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now let's look at the order that the Jewish scriptures were laid out. So the order was different in the Jewish scriptures, and the order that I just listed them in is how the Jewish scriptures have them laid out. Now that's different than the order of the King James. If you noticed, if you know the order of the King James Bible, they're not ordered like that. The last book of the King James is Malachi, whereas the last book of the Jewish scriptures was 2nd Chronicles. Now the order in which the Jewish canon was laid out, and the fact that it was divided into 3 main sections, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the writings, is very important in light of a couple of things that Jesus said if we're going to try to figure out which books in the Old Testament should actually be there or not. So we want to look at some things that Jesus said, and from that we can tell which books should be there and which books should not. But notice that the Jewish scriptures did not include any of those apocryphal books at all. The Jews never considered those books authentic or genuine, and they were not written in Hebrew as the other Jewish scriptures were, but were rather found in the Septuagint, which is a corrupt Greek translation of the Old Testament. Jesus, contrary to popular opinion, did not quote from or read from the Septuagint. He referred to the Old Testament having jots and tittles, which is unique only to Hebrew, not to Greek. He said in Matthew 5:18, "For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." So a jot is the smallest letter in the Hebrew language, and a tittle is the little diacritical marking which separates one letter, which distinguishes one letter from another in Hebrew. So you see like a little mark there on the corner of one of the letters, and the letter would look identical if it wasn't for that little tail hanging off there. That little tail there is a tittle. But in Greek, there are no jots and tittles. So when Jesus said jots and tittles, he's talking about the Hebrew Old Testament. That's the one that he was reading. He wasn't reading the Septuagint. Now, when the King James was translated, the apocryphal books were put in a separate section between the New and Old Testaments, not mixed in between, not mixed with the Old Testament books like it is in the Catholic Bible. And the reason for this is that King James translators knew that those books were not scripture. They were historical, and they might have had some historical value, but they're not scripture. They're not inspired, so they put them all by themselves between the testaments, not interspersed. So let's look at some scriptural evidence for the 39 books of the Hebrew Old Testament, which is found in the King James. Jesus recognized three major divisions in the Old Testament, just like the Jews had. He recognized the same three major divisions. He said in Luke 24:44, and he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. So Jesus showed the three divisions in the Old Testament: law of Moses, prophets, and the Psalms, or the writings. Now the Jews called that last section the writings, but it was sometimes referred to as the Psalms because the Psalms were, number one, the largest book in the writings, and number two, the Psalms were the first book in the writings. Jesus didn't mention a fourth division, though. He didn't mention any of these apocryphal books. Now Jesus made another statement that implicitly shows that the beginning and ending of the Jewish canon. Jesus said to the Pharisees in Matthew 23:35 that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. So Jesus said that upon these Jews was going to come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. He's talking about the blood of the prophets, because then he lists off two prophets, from Abel to Zechariah. Abel was the first prophet. Zechariah was the last prophet in time. Jesus said that the Pharisees and their fathers were responsible for the blood of the prophets. You can see that in Matthew 23:30-31. And he listed the first prophet as Abel, and the first prophet was killed in Genesis. Genesis 4:8, Abel was killed, is the first book of the Jewish canon. And the last prophet, Zacharias, was killed in the last book of the Jewish canon, 2 Chronicles 24:20-21. So at the end of the book of 2 Chronicles, at the very end of the Old Testament, as it was laid out in the Jewish canon, was the death of the last prophet. So Jesus is implicitly showing here is the Jewish canon, all the righteous blood of all the prophets, starting with Genesis and ending at the very end of the Old Testament, 2 Chronicles, with the death of Zacharias. Now Jesus was saying here that the Pharisees were responsible for all this blood, like I just said, from the first prophet in the first book to the last prophet in the last book. Think about it, from A to Z, Abel to Zechariah. The apocryphal books found in the Catholic Bible, at least some of them, such as Maccabees, took place in the 400-year period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. Yet Jesus didn't make reference to any of those books or anything that happened in them. See, those books were chronologically after the book of Malachi. The book of Malachi in the King James is the last book, because chronologically that was when the last prophet, the last book that was written in time. These other books were written in that, they call it the deuterocanonical time, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Yet Jesus never made any reference to anything that happened in there, and Jesus never made reference to prophets that were killed during that time or anything else. So anyway, that is the scriptural evidence for the 39 books of the Old Testament, the original Jewish canon, which is also found in the King James, and that's scriptural evidence which shows that the Catholic Old Testament is not the true Old Testament. Those additional books are spurious. They were written in Greek, not in Hebrew. So thank you anyway for your time, and I will talk to you again next week, Lord willing.